Welcome to Istanbul Innovation Days 2021. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the opening session for the first move of IID. And the theme of this session is rethinking the past and our roots. And the reason why we're focusing on this topic is that if we really want to imagine different development futures, we need to start questioning, are there paradigms, are there mental models, are there legacies that keep us constrained in the way we are doing and thinking about development issues that impact the way we conduct our work and prevent us to explore different options to greater impact. We are extremely lucky today to be joined by an esteemed panel of not only thinkers, but more importantly of doers, of experts that are working to proactively thinking not only about how do we reimagine the future, how do we question our past, and but also bring it into reality of our work. So I'm really pleased to introduce Danny Sriskandarajara, who is the CEO of Oxfam, Katie Bunten-Walmaru, who is the co-CEO of the African Visionary Fund, Payal Arora, who is a professor and chair in technology values at the Erasmus School of Philosophy at the University of Rotterdam. She is also the co-founder of Fem Lab. With us, we also have Pak Yanuar Nugroho, who is a former chief of staff to the president of Indonesia and has held other roles both in government and in academia. And last but certainly not least, Minister David Senge, who is the education minister of Sierra Leone, but also is the president's chief innovation advisor. We look forward to a very lively conversation. Danny, thank you very much for joining us today. In coming to lead Oxfam, you took a lot of decisions that were shifting not necessarily what Oxfam was doing, but how it was doing it. Can you give us one or two examples of the type of changes that you introduced?
Yeah, look, thank you. I think for us, the story for Oxfam over the last few years has really been about making sure that we prioritize the how as much as the what. And I think there's a lesson there for the whole of the development sector, because there's been this sense that development has been in some ways about the science of delivery, where in fact, I think it's as much about the art of transformation. And so, yes, it's really important that organizations like ours are making a tangible impact, that we're delivering cash or assistance, we're helping improve people's livelihoods. But it's also really important that when we go about doing those things, that we're doing them in as responsible and transformative a way as possible. I mean, one lesson for us, of course, has been about safeguarding. Oxfam, as many will recall, had some serious failures when it came to keeping people safe in our programs, particularly in Haiti 10 years ago. And we've been trying to put this notion of keeping people safe, of reducing and addressing the abuse of power at the heart of everything we do. So that's trying to build structures within our own organizations that minimize the abuse of power, but importantly, make sure that when we do work with communities, that we are doing what we can to make sure we're creating a safe environment so that people can report abuse of power when it happens. They can make sure that those things are being addressed. And so that's an example, I think, of what we've been doing. Another example is about trying to build a global network that looks less like a traditional international NGO and more like a 21st century network. I think the former, in the development sector is often involved, large northern founded, northern funded organizations headquartered in the global north, collecting money from people or governments in the north and transferring them down, if you will, a supply chain, a sort of trickle down of resources. And I think what's becoming clear is money and funding might trickle down, but power doesn't. And if you really want to be serious about distributing power, then you've got to think about, how your own network looks and feels. And so for Oxfam, we, as you've said, have spent a lot of time thinking about creating a new type of network, a diversified, globally balanced network, which will feature many more affiliates, is the language we use, but self-standing members of our network, so that we really can be the sort of global network that can build from below, but also beyond borders. And that's our aspiration.
Thank you, Danny. These are quite important and profound organizational changes that you introduced. They speak really well to the theme of this panel, which is about challenging our past assumptions and where we are coming from. And on the same vein, you recently said that you think this is the beginning of the end of the dominant NGOs as the primary organizing model for civic life. Can you tell us more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, look, I think there's some really amazing things happening in civic life. It's easier than ever before for each of us as citizens to be able to organize, to mobilize, to speak truth to power, to get things done. And I think, in the late 20th century, in many parts of the world, civil society was dominated in some ways by non-governmental organizations, people who wanted to do good, who wanted to promote human rights, who wanted to promote transparency, who wanted to end gender-based violence, might have gone about that by forming an organization and registering some form of civil society organization or non-profit organization. And that, I think, will continue to be really important, because institutions do matter. But I think what's been clear, especially in the last decade, since the Arab Revolution, since the Occupy movement, since Me Too, the women's marches, Black Lives Matter, there has been a growth in social movements, in citizen organizing that happens outside traditional NGOs. And of course, there's been a similar development when it comes to social enterprise, that many of the young activists that I meet around the world who want to make change, who want to do good, don't want to start an NGO. They want to start a social business that can make good impact, but at scale. And so, wherever we look, that formation of the non-profit or the NGO is important, but perhaps less important than we might have assumed it to be. And for me, the lesson is, look, the beauty of civil society, of civic life, is its diversity. We have social movements that have no formal registration, all the way to really well-established, powerful institutions, the NGOs, including, I'm happy to say and proud to say, organizations like Oxfam that have been around for 80 years, that have almost 10,000 staff around the world. And we need to play to that diversity. I think there is a really important objective to support a diverse and resilient civic life that I hope does include institutions like the big NGOs. I think they're important because they come with brand and trust and influence and have an ability to connect beyond borders. But those of us who have the privilege of working within those civil society organizations also need to acknowledge that we are only one part of the ecosystem of citizen action. And we need to play our part in nurturing and supporting those smaller organizations, those informal organizations and networks, the social movements that make up that wonderful diversity of civil society. So I really do think we need to be radical about sort of the sorts of formations in civic life we need to promote and embed truly sustainable development.
Thank you. Acknowledging that we all have different roles and how they change over time is another important message for us moving forward. Many of your actions and statements point to the challenge of a fundamental institutional renewal for Oxfam and the development sector in general. What do you think are the key mechanisms for fostering such renewal? And perhaps more importantly, do you really think we have it in ourselves?
I think we have it in ourselves. And even if we don't, many people around the world, many communities are demanding more radical action and more radical change. And for me, it's really important that we go back to the history of our sector and many of our institutions. Many of these institutions, including, international organizations like the UNDP, were created to address the sort of deep flaw in the world order, where we had some very rich countries in the global north and many, many countries that didn't have access to the sort of resources and development. And we created a development industry in order to be able to collect resources from people and governments in the global north and distribute them effectively and responsibly to get the job done, to alleviate poverty or increase prosperity in different parts of the world. That job is not done by any means. In fact, one of the tragedies of the COVID pandemic has been this great reversal in many of the achievements we had on poverty. At Oxfam, we think 500 million more people may be pushed into extreme poverty as a result of this pandemic. But I think we also need to keep an eye to the long-term future, that assumption that somehow these institutions sit between donors in the global north and needy beneficiaries in the global south was never particularly interesting or exciting. It just also feels particularly outdated today. And we need to come up with a new model. It still continues to collect resources from those people and communities that have relatively more, but does so in a more democratic, more transformative way. And I think we need to be thinking about what does the sustainable development landscape need to look like in, say, 20 or 30 years. We've seen such dramatic changes in the economic landscape, the geopolitical landscape in the last few decades. And I think those of us who are in the sort of social good landscape also need to think about what does the next generation of international institutions, what does that next international landscape look like when it comes to sustainable development? And let me be clear, I think it's really important that we do build from below and beyond borders. We still need to keep that sort of audacity of being internationalists, because the last thing we want is people and communities to retreat into themselves. We need to be able to connect with each other, stand in solidarity with each other, address global problems with global solutions. But in order to do that, I think we need a different set of institutions, probably with a different approach. And I think that's the long-term vision that we all need to be sort of checking ourselves against in the next few years. And for me, the COVID pandemic, presents exactly the right moment for us to have that reset, that rethink. This is such an unprecedented challenge to all sorts of things: economic stability, prosperity, livelihoods, gender equality. But we also need to come up with an unprecedented response. Part of that response will be about delivering aid, making sure we get the finance flows, making sure we get technology transfer. But an important part of it will be to sort of build the institutions that are fit for purpose for the future. So to me, that's the job at hand.
Katie, the development sector has been talking for ages about localizing aid. You are actually doing it. And you stress the importance of power of proximity and ceding power to African doers as opposed to donors. Can you tell us more about the dynamics of giving up power and how have you actually designed grant-making mechanisms that ensure that the power shift actually happens?
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and excited that UNDP is digging into these topics. I think one thing that I think about in terms of, just to start, why maybe localizing aid has fallen short, is that I think it's often conceptualized as only a mechanics problem, right? So if we just tinker with the mechanics of how aid is delivered at the local level, then we've localized aid. And I think that it's actually a mechanics and a power problem, right? So if priorities are still set in a very top-down way, you can partner with local organizations, but those partnerships are still going to be restricted, prescriptive, and not ceding power to grassroots leaders. And so I think for the African Visionary Fund, from the jump, we've really seen the problem we're trying to solve, which is the historic underfunding of African leaders, as both a mechanics problem, how do we get funding unblocked and moving to these leaders now, and a power problem. How do we move that funding in a way that shifts power to our African governance bodies and to our partners, and ultimately to their communities that they work in partnership with. And so we've done that in a few different ways, and I think at a few different levels. From the beginning, we had a founding working group. So we got started as an independent pooled fund less than a year ago, really from April 2020. And the first thing we did was set up a founding working group that was both majority African and majority do or not donor. And that group went through a 7-month process. They were incredibly generous with their time. We met in the beginning every 2 weeks for 2 hours. And we went through an entire organizational design process. So we looked at what should the fund's core values be? What's our theory of change? What's the gap in the sector in terms of intermediaries and funds? Like, what can we do? How can we best support African leaders? What do they need? Through to our leadership structure, our governance structure, our grant making criteria. That group really kind of informed every piece of our strategy and our organization. And I think what we knew going into that was that those affected by a problem have the most nuanced understanding of how to undo that problem. They have the most perspective and are best positioned to design solutions to a problem that they've experienced firsthand. And we definitely saw that in the ways that group's input has just informed our entire strategy. In particular, they dug in on our leadership structure. I think we talked a lot with that founding working group about the way we got the fund off the ground and the ability to bring in this group of founding funders. And as a white woman working in philanthropy, my undue privilege, access, and proximity to funders as another place where we need to acknowledge that there's a power in that. We can't ignore the fact that is helpful to us, that helps us move money for me to have that. But we need to use that power for good and ultimately cede it to our African governance bodies. And so that group really works on a co-leadership model that we are implementing now. We just kind of wrapped up the hiring process for our co-CEO, who is African and based on the continent, and even thinking about how our roles are split up and having their role really be centered around finding great organizations, expanding our pipeline, thinking about what sectors and countries and regions, managing our governance bodies, like really thinking about how those two roles are split was important to the founding working group. And I think another example of how we're trying to seed and share power. And then in addition to who makes decisions in our model and about the fund and about where our funding goes, we also understand that we needed to think about seeding power and shifting power in relation to how our funding is structured. So Bridgespan and Echoing Green did a study in the US that found that BIPOC-led organizations receive 76% less unrestricted funding. We don't have that number for African-led organizations from a data perspective, but I think we all know that is true, and if not exacerbated, for African leaders. And we also know as a sector that unrestricted funding is the most catalytic funding. It builds resilient, sustainable organizations that can actually invest in their overall resilience and organizational development. It's also a proxy for trust. And so we, as the African Visionary Fund, are committed to giving unrestricted multi-year funding, which we've done in our first grant commitment, because we want to also be seeding power to our partners who know how to spend that money better than us. And I think, the last thing I would say on kind of seeding and shifting power is we also acknowledge that there's so much more we can do as the African Visionary Fund. And we are early in our journey and are already starting to think about how do we think about potentially peer selection processes? How do we get our inaugural group of visionary partners involved in our governance? We have to kind of keep pushing ourselves and understand that there's not kind of one solution to this problem or one way to shift power. And there's lots of examples of groups trying to do it. And so we can kind of keep pushing ourselves as a sector to do that more and more.
It sounds like the journey of understanding power and privilege is a long and ongoing one. Another remarkable part of your journey is that you built a model for pooling and channeling funding into innovators in the midst of a global pandemic. And in the process, you even managed to bring on board important and significant partners. What has been the response of donors and partners to your model, especially given the COVID context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like many people, found myself reflecting on, where I was a year ago in early March 2020, and where the fund was a year ago was, I was just kind of getting things moving and was going to be starting full time on trying to get the fund off the ground in April. And in the midst of the first lockdown, in the midst of a lot of funders saying, we're only going to fund our current partners this year. We need to shift our extra funding to COVID relief. And I definitely had a moment of, is this the right timing to do this? Are we jumping in to set up this new entity and this new pooled fund in a really bad time? I think what became clear in 2020 was that actually our timing was pretty perfect. There's been, for a long time before 2020, for generations, local organizations have been delivering impact on the front lines in communities without the benefit of frontline funding. For generations, there have been conversations that resurface around equity and inclusion in philanthropy and racism in our development sector more broadly. However, the kind of events of 2020, and I think all of the kind of combined factors of last year made it so that we had kind of a step change in momentum in many ways. So, I think COVID-19 and global shutdowns kind of underlined the importance of grassroots actors, and that when everyone was kind of grounded, the people who could still deliver impact to communities, who could still move change forward, were people from those communities, in those communities, who'd been there and who were still there. And so I think we moved to a place in the sector where funders acknowledged that more definitively in 2020. And then I think the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent protests over the summer, for racial justice in the US, also kind of moved conversations around equity, inclusion, and racism in our broader sector forward considerably. And it also became something that I think the sector acknowledged we can't not consider. We can't not look at this problem. And so those two kind of movements in the sector gave us a different starting point as the fund, because it was in the midst of all of that our founding working group was designing our theory of change and getting everything off the ground. And it allowed us to push farther and be more radical in the ways we wanted to make this fund happen, and think about our governance and think about shifting power. And so I think for our funders, for our founding funders, a big driver was really the movement building piece, that this was a way to kind of put action behind this new momentum in kind of the thinking in the sector, was to really get money moving. As we've grown and we've started to bring on new funders, I think different funders have different drivers for why the African Visionary Fund is a good option for them. For some of them, it really is the movement building and power shifting aspect of our model. For others, they see us as a way to get pipeline to fund African-led organizations directly in their kind of focus areas. And I think there are some funders who really see us as an option to solve a lot of these logistical challenges that they run up against as they try to shift more funding to grassroots actors. Maybe they need to fund through a 501c3, or they do, very large grants. And because of the historical underfunding of African leaders, many of their organizational budgets are considered too small by funders who do those large scale grants. We are a way to do a large scale grant that will get to African leaders. And so I think different funders have different drivers that bring them to our work, and we can kind of solve a variety of problems for funders. I think that what inhibits funders, what kind of prevents them from jumping in, is on the one hand, we kind of acknowledge as the fund that we really have two clients, if we think about it that way. And we have funders and we have our visionary partners. And our visionary partners are our primary clients. Everything we do has to be in service of them and helping to build more resilient, sustainable African-led organizations. And so because of that, we kind of stick to our guns about, like, we want to offer multi-year unrestricted funding because that is what they need. So if we want to offer that as an intermediary grant maker, our donors have to give us multi-year unrestricted funding. And I think that there are still funders who are kind of tripped up by, oh, I have this sector focus, or I have these geographic country restrictions. And sometimes, we're kind of negotiating those conversations. I think that in some ways that comes down to thinking about where power lies and where power lies over where money goes. The other thing that I've seen in terms of funders being kind of inhibited in a way from jumping in is that many funders want to fund African-led organizations directly. And I think that is great. I don't think money needs to go through the African Visionary Fund just for the sake of it. However, I think that if you're a funder who wants to fund African-led organizations directly and historically have not, then that desire has to be followed by change. If you are kind of continuing to think about the same grant making criteria, structure your funding the same way, structure your pipeline management the same way, just the desire to fund African leaders is not enough if you have kind of historically not funded them. You actually have to change how you do your grant making. And I think for many funders, the African Visionary Fund is a way to move money to African leaders now while they do the work of figuring out how to restructure their grant making in a way that is more equitable in the long term.
Thank you for these great insights. And again, it sounds like to shift paradigms, we really need to question where we're coming from and what keeps us stuck in a certain way of doing things. Which brings me to my final question. What can others learn from your experience of identifying and supporting visionaries? How do others that want to do the same can do so and learn from your experience?
Yeah, I think of three things. So three kind of like learnings that I would hope this audience really like takes away and puts into action. One is broaden your networks and match the urgency of the need. We got 70 referrals from a network of referral partners, mostly incubators, accelerators, and fellowships on the ground. And we moved through to our selection process for our first set of visionary partners in 3 months. And we intentionally leaned into referral partners because we wanted to move money quickly. It's a global pandemic, and we had raised, at that point, this was late 2020, over $2 million in multi-year unrestricted funding. And so we wanted to move money quickly. We also understand over time, we need to broaden networks and remove more and more barriers of entry into the fund. But I think sometimes in philanthropy, in funding, when we're thinking about kind of these big power dynamics and how are we going to shift power, which are incredibly important conversations to have, sometimes we lose the urgency of the need to get money moving now. And so I think thinking about ways that you can institutionally learn and start to unravel the kind of bias and systems and racism that have built the system we operate in, and that we need to disentangle and reimagine that system, while also finding ways to move money now and understand that there is an urgency to getting dollars to the grassroots. The second kind of learning, I would say, is for funders in particular not to fall into the capacity trap. So we, as the fund, offer multi-year unrestricted funding. We do also offer each of our partners an additional earmarked grant every year towards an organizational development need. But we talk about the reason we offer that capacity support really intentionally. So oftentimes there is an inherent assumption and stereotype that African-led organizations are somehow inherently less capacitated and therefore need capacity building. Every organization, like of every size, no matter the leadership, has organizational development gaps and needs that they want to invest in and that they want to grow. And so as a responsible funder, we want to provide that support because that's how you build resilient organizations, not because we fund African-led organizations. And so I think funders in particular need to be careful of this instinct that I see sometimes to say that the solution to a historical underfunding problem is a capacity building program or a fellowship. Like if you're going to offer a fellowship, it better come with multi-year unrestricted funding for your fellows. I think we just need to be really careful about how we think about capacity, because if the problem is historic underfunding, that is a funder side problem and not a visionary partner side problem. And the last thing I'll say on this question, I think this idea of usual suspects, like I said, we want to continue removing barriers to entry to the African Visionary Fund and broaden our networks and have a even more open and inclusive application system as our bandwidth grows. That being said, I think we also need to be careful to remember that the funding gap is so huge that the idea of usual suspects is really relative. So if 0.4% of all international funding is going to grassroots groups, we can't really call any of them usual suspects. If you think about the usual suspects of Western-led organizations, they're getting millions and millions of dollars in funding, right? The usual suspects at a grassroots level are not getting that level of funding because the gap is so big. So I think it's important, of course, to think about inclusivity and to really understand the relativity of what we consider a kind of usual suspect organization.
Payal, you showed through your research that Western assumption, for example, about how the poor should use the internet actually prevent us from understanding what is actually happening. I mean, how they actually are using it. What is it that we miss when we look at the world the way it should be, rather than exploring and being curious about how it actually is? What are we missing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that is at the heart of development work, isn't it? There is an innate sense of trying to do good, and there is underneath that whole sort of apparatus is this deep paternalism that we somehow need to nurture, take care of the vast marginalized majority, as I call them, the global poor, that happens to be billions of people, right? And the fundamental point here is that when we are in relation with the global poor, we look at them as subjects that need aid, because they do, right? But we look at it often as it is somehow their fault, or somehow that there's a lack. And this comes from a history of a deficiency logic, that they're not motivated, they're lazy, they are somehow obstacles to their own growth. And of course, there is a sort of overt enthusiasm for technology. So we undermine their resiliencies and their capacities. And simultaneously, we overestimate the capacity of technologies to resolve what we consider as deep human failures on their part, right? But the reality is that a number of people who are in these low-income contexts just fundamentally happen to be at a position where they are unfortunate. They were born at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and it could have just as well been you and I, right? And we have to understand that these are the way in which we approach them are in terms of conditionalities, in terms of what we expect them to do, because we see it as an exchange, as a sort of a parent-child exchange, and that based on you do these things and we will provide you these technologies, and thereby these are the demands we expect from you. But it doesn't work that way. These are oftentimes adults who already demonstrated deep resiliences and creativity in spite of all the obstacles around them, oftentimes of our own making, institutional and otherwise, because we have constrained them in such straitjackets of expectations. So just take the digital technologies, for instance, right? We expect them to somehow behave radically different from you and I in the way in which they use digital media. So we expect them to be more utility driven. We expect them to somehow, when they get access to the internet, check, information for their children, healthcare, and mainly what we consider doing, the good things for society and for themselves, utility driven. Whereas we basically accept that it is very much part of our lifestyle, that majority of what we do are leisure oriented. We game, we socialize, we are watching Netflix, we're consuming entertainment. In fact, the vast amount of our data that is diverted into these directions. And yet we think that they are somehow exotic beings, but in my more than a decade and a half of research at the ground level has shown that they're very much like you and I. They do exactly what we do, and whether we like it or not. So we have to start from the assumption that we're all similar in our aspirations, our needs, our deep desires, and we have to see how within which we can embed and incentivize them to possibly, capitalize on these technologies, give them the sort of right tools which are appropriate for them so they can actually self-actualize, which is really the pathway to, progress, isn't it?
That leads us nicely to our next question. Tell us more about the Fem Lab. What does it look like when we question predominant narratives about the way poor people use technologies or female gig workers use platforms in Bangladesh? What does the practice of opening up different worldviews look like?
Yeah, so, Fem Lab is basically the long form is feminist approaches to digital labor collectives. And the idea is that it is about recognizing and really putting at the center low-income women workers in particularly global South context, so we can reimagine what the future of work looks like for the global norm, because that is the global norm. So FemLab is a seed-funded initiative by IDRC, a Canadian grant agency, and it was co-founded by my colleague Usha Raman in University of Hyderabad and myself. And we have a wonderful team sort of spread across, in Hyderabad and of course in different parts of India, in Bangladesh, Germany, and Netherlands. And we are hoping to expand on that and in terms of our sites. So right now we're focused on context within Bangladesh and in India. And in particular, we're looking at 5 sectors. It's not because it is specific to, that these are the only sectors. It's just a starting point. And it is basically construction, salon services, artisanal work, garment industries, as well as sanitation. And the reason we chose these sites is because they at least half, if not more, are women dominated. It is women dominated labor, and often it's the worst kind of labor. It's the most dehumanizing, routinized, and invisible kind of labor, deeply underpaid, deeply undervalued. And, this is one of the fundamental issues we face when we talk about, this so-called global poor as a singular unit, is that they're actually not, right? So even when you have unions, for example, in Bangladesh, for instance, they do not necessarily represent women interests, even though majority of the women workers in the garment industry happen to be the backbone of this industry, which is upholding the GDP of Bangladesh. So, the unions are often male dominated, whereas the labor force is, we're talking about 70 to 80% female, right? And when it comes to the artisanal sector, for instance, it becomes even more dominated by women in terms of, backbreaking work, often relegated into the homes because these are not at factory levels, which adds layers of precarity. So what Fem Lab does is it basically looks at a couple of things. It looks at three parts of the equation for us to have a sort of an ecosystem design thinking approach, right? It puts these women's voices at the center, not in terms of their grievances only, because look, we all know it's been decades, we know the situation at hand. Let's stop calling it an information deficit. We have an information abundance of the state of these women workers in, say, for example, Bangladesh. We have decades of research showing that many of them, in fact, half of them experience some kind of exploitation, sexual harassment, rape. I mean, the conditions are extraordinary and excruciating. And it doesn't seem to let go very easily, right? Because institutions need to be reimagined, rethought, especially along the whole global supply chain. So there is putting them at the center also in terms of their resiliencies and the way in which they capitalize on digital media technologies and other kinds of social solidarities to get their voices heard despite these situations. And our job then, the second fold, is to see how can we think about redesigning platforms, redesigning media systems, how can we guide designers, developers, programmers who really genuinely want to do the right thing, want to create ethical AI, responsible AI, empathetic design, which are a lot of buzzwords out there. But how do you get informed by what are the kinds of needs and desires and ongoing practices? And through that imaginary, they can help shape the systems that support already existing work, right? And then the third part of this is a digital storytelling campaign, which is basically amplifying these sort of insights in ways that it can become everybody's concern, everybody's deep engagement in, because we at our heart are sort of supporting these systems as consumers. We need to be aware of what's going on, but not just aware, we need to rehumanize a lot of these people through, we use humor, animations, make it very accessible, because the reality is academia is really writing for academia. A lot of reports are, by development agencies have been written for other development agencies or for grant agencies. So we need to see that this is about change. And for change to happen, it should be everybody's business, right? And so digital storytelling can be a very powerful tool to make it like sort of normalize and sort of create a sort of underlying deep anger, justifiable anger, which pushes and demands for sustainable change. And that's really at the heart of Fem Lab and its work.
And since you talked about digital storytelling, what do you see happening at the intersection of anthropology and digital tools in the Global South? Do you see a new discipline emerging? And how can it help development organizations question our assumptions?
Yeah, so, I think it's a wonderful question in terms of the relationship between anthropology, or what we call thick data, right? Thick data in terms of it's the messiness of everyday life and the organizing of the messiness of everyday life, which addresses fundamental questions such as how and the why. Getting at the heart of the matter is, why do people do what they do? Because oftentimes it may not make sense to us. It may seem irrational, it may seem stupid, and it sort of, the media narratives about the global poor tend to be that these people are so illiterate, they're so not very, they can be very naive, and usually the sort of deficit model, that they lack fundamental sort of know-how, capacities, etc., right? And what anthropology does is it unpacks the entire complexity of the human condition and shows us their deep resiliencies and why certain ideas continue to stick the way they do. it provides a sort of rationality to what appears to us as irrational only because it is so far removed from our everyday lives and conditions and context that we're unable to build empathy. So the way I look at anthropology in a contemporary sense is that it owes it to the unraveling and rehumanizing, and I know I keep repeating that, but it is really important to rehumanize the so-called vast underclass, which we oftentimes would like to forget. I don't think we forget, by chance. It is like we would like to forget because it is hard for us to then go about our everyday lives with them at the backdrop, right? And, this is very important to, put in touch with the big data. So the thick data comes in conjunction with the big data, because that gives us a sense of overwhelming trends across a sort of a global paradigm, because we know it's not necessarily national centric. Through hashtag solidarities, we've seen movements which have spanned across borders. We've seen group affiliations and empathies cross cultures, cross religions, cross backgrounds, which is for better and worse, right? So you can even have fundamentalism get like a whole new force. The fringe becomes mainstream. So I'm not trying to romanticize that, but these give us a sort of a earmark about how prevalent and how global certain trends are. And then the how and the why gets answered through anthropology. And together they can have, the big and the thick data can come together in a sort of a healthy, respectful way to try to, address these very formidable challenges that we face today, which are intrinsically global in nature, right? The problem right now, and it has always been the case, is that decision-making at the heart has always privileged, or shall we say biased, quantitative, big data analytics, because it feels much more scientific. But we know, if we honestly look at the research, we know that it is a sliver of the representation. For example, Twitter data, if you do a sort of data scraping, it is a small sliver, which happen to be often white, male, middle class, that tends to be the most vocal on these platforms, right? And all extreme opinions tend to get the most shares, gets the most eyeballs, gets the most clicks. Whether people are outraged or in solidarity, it doesn't matter. It doesn't encapsulate why people are reacting, but they do react, and that becomes the narrative. That becomes a dominant narrative, which often can be the fringe, and then that becomes reified through mainstream. So if we are to protect ourselves from these sort of deep fictions becoming our future realities, we need to simultaneously respect anthropology just as much as we tend to respect big data analytics, because it is extremely flawed in the way it is playing out right now. And we have plenty of information evidence right now in the last few years, from automating inequality, as we know, or algorithms of discrimination, all these different books which have well encapsulated these problems, right? So yes, but one last point on this regard is that in terms of a new discipline, I hope not. I'm more of an anti-discipline person, because the problem with disciplines is that we tend to create a border around it, like a sort of silos, and then we make it into some other, right? So the problem of not paying heed to anthropology, like the thick data and big data, doesn't have to result in creating another problem, which is a new discipline. What we need to do is become a little more irreverent towards disciplines. And we need to follow the question. We need to ask the question and then say, what can help us in answering this question, and become deeply irreverent and break the sacred boundaries, because we need every ounce of help with the kind of challenges we have, which is planetary, and which is deeply about sustainability of the very existence of the planet, to that of global governance, financial reform, some of the fundamentals in rethinking institutions beyond the national borders, and then the human element, which is about the social solidarities, the sustaining of democracies and the respect of each other, which is often failing in the way in which the algorithmic logics are playing out. So with these three major challenges, we need to take and become very, very creative and seek all kinds of disciplines for the help that we very much need.
Paki Anwar, you have a unique vantage point, having worked in academia, advised two presidents, and worked closely with a number of development organizations and international initiatives, like, for example, the Open Government Partnerships. Do you see Western paradigm still dominating the way the world looks at a country like Indonesia?
Thank you for this question. Yes, I am an academic, a scholar, and I remain one. Indeed, I have experienced quite a significant period working with and assisting the Indonesian government through my work with the Executive Office of the President under President Joko Widodo from 2015 to 2019, and previously President's Delivery Unit for Development Monitoring and Oversight under President Yudhoyono from 2012 until 2014. And as such, I was involved with the political dynamics of the government. And I have to say that there is a stark difference between the paradigms of political dynamics and scholarly dynamics. Your question, are Western paradigms still dominating the way the world looks at a country like Indonesia? Of course, we can always debate the answer. But let me put this from my perspective. From scholarly point of view, perhaps yes, the evidence is abundant. From the political point of view, clearly no. No modern country today will let others tell them what to do and what to think. If you ask me how do I see it, I would say that I understand the difference between these two. Open government is an excellent example. While certainly values like openness, transparency, accountability, participation, among others, are formulated, not necessarily defined, perhaps earlier by Western or Northern countries. Other countries in Southern Hemisphere or in the East too believe in more or less the same values, although they might be articulated or formulated differently. This is why some of them happily and voluntarily join the partnership, join OGP. We started with 8 countries. Indonesia was among one of these 8 pioneers of OGP 10 years ago. And now we have 79 member countries. But the fact that OGP still works hard to reach out and invite more countries to join in itself is the proof of this tension. The same goes with other international strategic initiatives like SDGs or climate agenda. So, what do these constructs prevent us from understanding the country and its ambition? My answer is the context. That is, what is deemed important by the country, what is seen as priority by the country. Because, if any, the so-called Western construct would impose what is important and priority based on Western paradigm, consideration, and thinking, the context of which is not local. So, if this is the case, then global initiatives such as SDGs, OGP, climate action would be disembedded from the local context. Initiatives such as those must be re-embedded, contextualized, and articulated within the local or national setting. That's my take.
And on that very note about local context, Don't Do It Like Denmark has become a bit of a meme expressing the tiredness of developing countries of being told to mimic Western constructs. Do you feel this sentiment is still there? And if so, what can development organizations do to avoid imposing recipes from far away?
Thank you. It's quite a challenging question. Yes, again, politically, I would argue that there is this tiredness or reluctance of being told to mimic Western construct. It is there. We should not deny it. For example, in my country, everyone in Indonesia would still remember back in 1998, I think, how the IMF, for example, told the government of Indonesia to undertake the so-called structural adjustment program after the monetary crisis, 1996, 1998. But then it turned out that it created more problems than giving solutions, for example. So if you ask, is this settlement? So, I mean, if you ask, is this sentiment still there? To some extent, yes. Even quite a number of scholars use this sentiment as subjects for investigation or research. I think what development partners can do is, instead of promoting best practices from far away, they can help share what work and what do not work. I believe there is no the so-called best practices. There are only practices. In some contexts, they work. In others, they don't. I think what would add value to development partners is when they can stimulate discussions on that. What I mean is that why in certain contexts the idea works and in others it doesn't. To me, this is very much also related to the very concept of innovation itself. No one can force innovation. No one can import innovation and apply or adopt it and expect the same results would come up as in the previous context of that innovation. No. I think what we can do is to create the enabling environment in which innovation may and can happen. For innovation in or for development, the notion is even more relevant. Again, taking OGP, for example, or SDGs. Innovations that work in a or some countries can be inspiration to other countries. But certainly, they need to create their own enabling environment. It is where development partners, I believe, can help.
Thanks for that reminder. This leads us to another challenge to best practices, namely the fact that the world is changing at a faster speed. Like many other countries in Asia Pacific, Indonesia has changed dramatically in the last decade. What can development organizations do to keep up with this pace? What do we need to do to keep up with the constant change and challenge our notions that might have become obsolete?
Well, this is a very difficult question, and I do not pretend I know the answer. But from my experience working in and with the government, I think the most important aspect is to ensure that development organizations or development partners remain relevant. And this is not easy. Really, this is not easy. Not only that the world evolves and develops in so many different ways, our world becomes very complex today, but I think understanding the context in which development partners organization work is very, very important. So perhaps working closely not only with the government, but also with other stakeholders like civil society, media, academia, business, or other interest groups would help development partners grasp and feel the dynamics. It would help them have more nuanced and deeper understanding of what's going on. And I think from there, deliver what is best. And since the future is always something that, well, makes us feel uncertain, especially now with this COVID pandemic, everyone feels that way. Perhaps development organizations can start equipping themselves, not just with classical or conventional methods in helping the governments plan and do development, such as, sorry to mention here, like theory of change or logical framework in planning or policy research and so on. But perhaps it is time now to embrace a new approach, such as including futures studies, for example, in development. I have experience and I would share with you, for example, using foresight in policy making and development planning. There is a fundamental difference in foresight, that the future is neither forecasted nor predicted. The future is shaped collectively. I think, taking this as example, development partners could be a true partner for the government, that together, development partners and government, we unfold what the future holds for us. I think that's my answer to that question.
Minister Sanga, you've been a firm supporter of homegrown Sierra Leone expertise as a driver of a country's development path. Do you see development organizations sharing the same intent of growing local talent?
Well, I think for me as a government agency, whether it's within the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation or the Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary Education, the goal of government is to build its human capacity. And that means bring talent and help that talent improve. And so our objectives are primarily in investing in humans. And one of the things that we've been able to see at the STI in the innovation department was we grew from one person, it was literally myself and the president, to 60, 70 people now, from interns to recent graduates to full-time staff in multiple offices that are coding, that are doing design thinking, user research on drones and on several other projects that we're doing. It's important that the innovation, particularly when you're thinking across the country, is not just about an individual, no, it's about a handful of people, but it's about the mentality and changing the people who feel like they can be the problem solvers. I want young Sierra Leoneans to see themselves and identify themselves, that they can solve problems no matter who or where they come from. We have lots of girls and young women doing science and STEM, and a lot of our leadership is women as well, including the technical core staff that we have. So it's the incentive and imperatives are different. And I think a lot of the development organizations, when we engage, when we go back and forth, it's clear to them that this is who we are, and we try to communicate that effectively to them. It's difficult to paint all of them with a brush stroke, but I think the sentiment of human capital development, not just for the country, but within our organizations, is becoming clearer across institutions.
If you could turn the tables, how would you design a development intervention that helps you work as Minister of Education? What would you ask organizations like UNDP to learn and unlearn about Sierra Leone to help your work?
I think two things that we can learn. You see, before I joined government, I was in private sector research. I was at IBM. And I think as people who are technical and coding, you're always thinking, oh, but the government people don't really understand. We have to convince them. And then I came into government, and then everybody on my team codes and designs. Then it's difficult for the people on the outside to understand that we're ready to go and that we won't be the bottleneck. So I think, particularly with the flipped and on my team specifically, and in general in Sierra Leone and with this government, it's that the technical ability is there. We're ready and eager to learn. We won't be the bottleneck. It's also general that government and bureaucracy will be the bottleneck. And I'm sure that's true depending on who you're collaborating with. But what I've seen is that we we within the organizations that I lead are not the bottleneck, and in general with the government of Sierra Leone, we're not necessarily the bottleneck. So it's unlearning the assumption. We're forced to assume that government is big and bureaucratic and slow, that they're probably not technical, they're not really the coders and the techies and don't really know what's up. If you undo and unlearn these things, the projects can go much further.
Thank you for that comment. What is a mental model that you think is holding us back when understanding the context of a country like Sierra Leone?
I think my organization, my framework definitely has changed a little bit. I think I didn't necessarily think about innovation policy before I joined government, and not because I didn't think it was important, but that's not the sphere in which my work was. So I've expanded what my understanding of problem solving and innovation and applying tools to solve critical problems in new ways represents. That it's beyond the technology and beyond the machines, and includes the policies and frameworks and processes as well. And those things are as important that we innovate across how we think and solve problems in public sector as it is in the private and tech sector.
And so has your understanding of innovation changed since you have been working in government?
When I started the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, a mentality of a startup. So even though we're in public sector, we think like a startup. We think like an agile private sector entity. And it's not because governments and those institutions cannot think like a public sector institution. I think it's just a mentality and a shift that the people who maybe spend a long time at the office, who are not asking necessarily, oh, it's 4 p.m. I need to leave. Oh, it's 7 p.m. I can't pick up a call or an email. Oh, but I don't want to do this because I don't know how it will look like it might fail. The people who do that are usually private sector and startups. And this is about risk. So I lower the risk. We have to lower the risk of failure in public sector. But it's difficult to do that because when you fail in that way, it's humans' lives, it's people's well-being. And so the costs for failing is high in public sector, and it's punishable by votes and elections and things, as opposed to, I don't know, shareholder dollars that are different. They're also important, but different.
The first part of this panel, which was really meant to set the scene for move one of IID, helping us reflect on the paradigms that keep us locked in our current understanding of development and the challenges that it poses. But most important, pointing us through the reflection from practice, from leading practitioners, to ways in which we can start challenging these paradigms and open ourselves to different understanding of what the future of development might be. We now move on to the Q&A session, and I'm very much looking forward to a lively discussion.